The land before the legend. Zulu history before Shaka. Before the Zulu were feared, before their shields darkened the horizon, before British officers would write their names in disbelief in blood. There was only land, cattle, and memory. Southern Africa, centuries before European conquest, was not empty, silent, or waiting to be claimed. It was alive with movement. Rivers marked boundaries not on maps, but in stories. Hills were not obstacles. They were ancestors. And history was not written. It was spoken, sung, and remembered. The region that would later be called KwaZulu-Natal was a place of rolling grasslands, river valleys, and coastal plains. Rain came in cycles. Drought came without mercy. Survival depended on understanding the land, not conquering it. The people who lived here were part of the Nguni-speaking world. They were farmers, herders, hunters, and traders. Their wealth was measured not in gold or land deeds, but in cattle. Cattle were life itself. They fed families. They paid bride wealth. They sealed alliances. They were offered to ancestors. To lose cattle was not just poverty. It was social death. Zulu society, in this early period, was not an empire. It was one of many small clans, each led by a chief whose authority rested on consensus, tradition, and lineage. Power was personal, not absolute. Leadership could be challenged. Chiefs ruled by persuasion as much as force. Conflict existed, but it was limited. Wars were ritualized, controlled affairs. Young men fought with long throwing spears and shields made of cowhide. Battles were often about honor, cattle theft, or settling disputes, not annihilation. Casualties were relatively low. Victory was symbolic as much as physical. This was not weakness. It was a system built for balance, not domination. Age mattered deeply. Zulu society was structured around age grades. Boys herded cattle. Young men trained for battle. Elders advised, judged, and remembered. Knowledge flowed downward. Loyalty flowed upward. Women were central to survival. They farmed the land, raised children, maintained households, and preserved oral history. Though excluded from warfare, their influence shaped alliances, inheritance, and continuity. Spiritual life was woven into everything. The Zulu believed in Amidlozi, ancestral spirits who watched, judged, and intervened in the living world. Misfortune was not random. Drought, illness, and defeat were signs of imbalance between the living and the dead. Diviners interpreted these signs. Rituals restored harmony. The past was never gone. It walked beside the present. This worldview created a society deeply aware of consequence. Every action echoed forward. Yet by the late 18th century, the balance was breaking. Population growth increased pressure on land. Climate shifts brought unpredictable rainfall. Competition for cattle intensified. Trade networks expanded, especially along the coast, where European traders exchanged goods for ivory and labor. These pressures did not cause immediate collapse, but they strained the old systems. Small conflicts became more frequent. Raids grew harsher. Defeat carried greater consequences. The Nguni world was becoming more violent, not because of savagery, but because the environment demanded adaptation. It was into this tense, changing world that a child was born, a child who would absorb humiliation, fear, and discipline, and later reshape everything. His name was Shaka, but at this point in history, he was nothing, the illegitimate son of a minor chief, an outcast, a boy without inheritance, protection, or honor. The Zulu clan itself was insignificant, overshadowed by stronger neighbors, politically fragile, militarily unremarkable. No one, not the elders, not rival chiefs, not even the ancestors, could have predicted what was coming. The land was quiet. The traditions were old. The rules were known. But the world was changing, and soon the old way of war would die, not with fire, not with guns, but with discipline, a world of clans and spears. Zulu society, honor, ritual warfare. Before the Zulu became an army, they were a society bound by rhythm. Life moved according to seasons, age, and obligation. Nothing existed in isolation. A man was not just an individual. He was a son, a warrior in training, a future elder, and a living link between ancestors and descendants yet unborn. At the heart of this world stood the clan. Each clan traced its lineage back through generations, remembered not through written records, but through names spoken aloud. Genealogy was history. To forget an ancestor was to weaken yourself. To dishonor the past was to invite misfortune. Leadership rested with the chief, but his power was limited. He was not a king. He did not rule by terror. His authority came from tradition, wisdom, and the consent of his people. If he failed, he could be abandoned. Councils of elders advised him. Disputes were debated publicly. Justice was restorative, not absolute. Compensation mattered more than punishment. This balance created stability, but it also limited ambition. Young men grew up knowing their place. From childhood, boys herded cattle across open land, learning patience, endurance, and awareness. These were not simple tasks. A lost cow could spark conflict between families or clans. Responsibility came early. As boys reached adolescence, they entered age-based groups that would shape the rest of their lives. These groups were more than social categories. They were lifelong bonds. Initiation was not ceremonial softness. It was discipline, endurance, learning to obey before being allowed to command. Weapons training existed, but it was restrained. The primary weapon was a throwing spear, designed to wound or disarm, not kill en masse. Shields were wide and defensive. Combat emphasized agility and courage, not slaughter. Battles were usually brief. Two groups would meet. Warriors would display themselves. Spears would be thrown. Shields would clash. When one side showed weakness, the fight ended. The goal was not extermination. It was dominance without annihilation. This system reflected deeper values. Death was not meaningless. Killing carried spiritual consequence. Bloodshed disrupted harmony between the living and the ancestors. Excessive violence invited retaliation, not just from enemies, but from the unseen world. Honor mattered. A coward brought shame not only on himself, but on his lineage. A brave man earned respect even from enemies. Songs would remember him. Stories would preserve his name. Women played a different but equally vital role. They were the keepers of the household, the fields, and memory. Through marriage, women forged alliances between clans. Through motherhood, they ensured continuity. Through oral tradition, they shaped how the past would be remembered. Though excluded from battle, their influence was constant and powerful. Marriage itself was political. La bola, bride wealth paid in cattle, was not a purchase. It was a bond between families. It created obligation, respect, and shared future responsibility. A marriage without cattle was unstable. A clan without marriages was isolated. Spiritual belief governed every stage of life. The ancestors were not distant gods. They were ever present. They watched over cattle harvests and births. They punished arrogance. They rewarded balance. Illness, drought, and defeat were not accidents. They were messages. Diviners interpreted these messages. Rituals restored alignment. Sacrifice was not superstition. It was communication. This worldview produced people who were deeply cautious. Every decision mattered. But as the 18th century drew to a close, caution began to fail. Population pressure strained grazing lands. Drought cycles intensified competition. Trade introduced new inequalities. Neighboring clans grew more aggressive. The old rules began to crack. Raids escalated. Disputes turned deadlier. Young warriors returned not just with cattle, but with blood on their hands. Honor remained, but fear entered alongside it. The balance that preserved peace now limited survival. Some clans adapted slowly. Others did not adapt at all. And within this world of restraint and ritual, a dangerous idea was forming. That war did not have to end quickly. That mercy was a choice, and that discipline could replace tradition. The old way of fighting, cautious, symbolic, limited, was becoming obsolete. A new kind of warfare was coming, one that demanded total loyalty, total obedience, total sacrifice. The clans did not see it yet. They still believed the rules would hold. But soon, a single man would tear those rules apart and force the Nguni world to evolve or be destroyed. Birth of an outsider. Shaka's childhood in exile. History often pretends that great leaders are born with destiny written into their blood. The truth is colder. Shaka janam jishi shahigar main nahi hua. Uski payday celebration nai, sharam. He was born around the late 18th century, the son of Senzanga Kona, a minor Zulu chief, and Nandi, a woman of strong will and unyielding pride. Their union was not formalized through proper bride wealth. In Zulu society, that detail mattered more than affection, more than intention. Without Labola, a child was vulnerable. From the moment Shaka could walk, he carried the mark of illegitimacy. Whispers followed him. Insults shaped him. Other children mocked him. Elders looked away. Even his own father kept distance, not out of hatred, but convenience. Nandi refused to accept humiliation. She defended her son fiercely, confronting those who insulted him, refusing silence. But defiance had a cost. The clan grew hostile. Pressure mounted. Eventually, Nandi and her child were driven away. Exile was not symbolic. It was survival. Mother and son moved between clans, seeking refuge. Each stay was temporary. Each welcome carried suspicion. Food was scarce. Respect was absent. Shaka learned early what rejection felt like, and what dependence did to dignity. As a boy, he herded cattle for other families. He slept where he was allowed. He listened more than he spoke. Every insult sharpened him. Every slight was remembered. Pain did not break him. It disciplined him. Where other boys laughed and played, Shaka observed. He watched how men commanded obedience, how fear silenced voices, how strength created safety and weakness invited cruelty. His body hardened under labor. Bare feet toughened on stone and thorn. Hunger became familiar. Fatigue became normal. But isolation shaped his mind more than his muscles. Shaka became inward, controlled, calculating. He learned restraint not as virtue, but as necessity. An outburst could mean expulsion. A mistake could mean starvation. This was not childhood. It was training. Eventually, Shaka and Nandi found refuge among the Mthethwa, a stronger neighboring group led by Dingiswayo, a chief unlike others. Dingiswayo was a visionary. He believed in uniting clans rather than destroying them. He experimented with new military organization. He valued loyalty over lineage, talent over birth. Under Dingiswayo, Shaka found something he had never known: structure. He was inducted into a warrior group. For the first time, his aggression had direction. His endurance had purpose. His silence had weight. He trained relentlessly. Other warriors noticed him. His stamina was unnatural. His pain tolerance extreme. He fought at close range without hesitation. He did not retreat easily. He did not forget. More importantly, he obeyed absolutely until the moment he was allowed to lead. Dingiswayo recognized this. He began to promote Shaka, not because of his birth, but because of his effectiveness. For Shaka, this was revelation. The old system that had rejected him, lineage, tradition, inherited honor, was not inevitable. Power could be constructed. Loyalty could be engineered. But beneath discipline, something darker grew. Shaka did not seek acceptance. He sought control. Humiliation had taught him that mercy was unreliable. Tradition had taught him that rules protected the powerful, not the vulnerable. In his mind, a new logic formed. Fear was honest, discipline was absolute, and strength was the only protection that never abandoned you. By the time Shaka reached adulthood, he was no longer the outcast child. He was a hardened warrior with a reputation. Silent, focused, relentless. But the wound of exile never healed. It waited. And when the opportunity came, when Dingiswayo was killed by rivals and the political order fractured, Shaka would step forward not as a reformer, but as a man who had learned exactly how pain could be turned into power, forging a new way of war. The military revolution of Shaka Zulu. Wars are not changed by weapons alone. They are changed by ideas. When Shaka rose within the Mthethwa ranks, the battlefield he inherited was governed by tradition, not efficiency. Spears were thrown from a distance. Engagements were brief. Warriors withdrew once honor was satisfied. To Shaka, this was not honorable. It was wasteful. He had learned something different from a lifetime of hardship. Conflict, if left unfinished, always returned. Shaka began by questioning everything. Why throw a spear and leave your enemy alive? Why retreat when fear had already taken hold? Why treat war as ritual when survival demanded certainty? The answers disturbed elders. But Shaka did not argue with words. He experimented with bodies. The first transformation was a spear. The traditional assegai was long and light, meant for throwing. Shaka replaced it with shorter, heavier stabbing spear, the ikawa, named for the sound it made when withdrawn from a wound. This weapon forced proximity. A warrior could no longer kill from a distance. He had to step inside the enemy's reach. He had to feel resistance. He had to commit. Cowardice became impossible. Next came the shield. Zulu shields already existed, but Shaka standardized them. Larger, stronger, designed not just for defense, but for control. Warriors used a shield to hook, pull, and expose opponents before striking. Combat became intimate, personal, decisive. Then Shaka attacked the greatest weakness of all, disorder. He reorganized warriors into regiments, amabutho, based on age, housed together, trained together, and loyal not to clan elders, but to the king himself. This broke the old social structure. Young men no longer fought beside cousins and uncles. They fought beside peers. Identity shifted from family to unit, from tradition to command. Obedience became absolute. Training was brutal. Warriors ran long distances barefoot across thorns and stone. Weakness was punished. Hesitation was corrected. Endurance was mandatory. Pain was normalized. Shaka believed a soldier who feared suffering would flee when it mattered most. He removed that option. Formations changed warfare entirely. Instead of loose skirmishes, Shaka introduced coordinated movement, later described as a buffalo horns formation. The chest fixed the enemy in place. The horns enveloped the flanks. The loins remained in reserve, disciplined and controlled. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Each warrior knew his position. Each movement served the whole. Retreat was not an individual decision. It was an order. Enemies were no longer allowed to escape. Defeated forces were pursued relentlessly. Survivors were absorbed or destroyed. Resistance was punished publicly. War was no longer about settlement. It was about finality. Psychology became a weapon. Shaka understood fear before battle mattered more than bloodshed during it. Messengers spread stories of invincible regiments. Displays of discipline intimidated rivals before contact was made. The sound of marching feet, the rhythm of shields striking, the silence before attack. These were calculated. Victory reinforced reputation. Reputation reduced resistance. Reduced resistance saved Zulu lives. Mercy became strategic, not moral. Those who submitted early lived. Those who resisted learned why resistance was fatal. Traditional leaders were stripped of authority. Loyal commanders were elevated regardless of birth. Power flowed upward, not outward. Shaka did not rule through affection. He ruled through certainty. Yet this transformation was not without cost. The emotional bonds of clan life weakened. Individual identity dissolved into regimental function. Families lost sons to constant campaigning. Grief was suppressed. Discipline replaced mourning. The Zulu people became something new, not just a society that fought, but a state built for war. Neighbors were stunned. Clans that had relied on ritual warfare collapsed under sustained pressure. Old alliances shattered. The region destabilized. What historians would later call the Mfikane, the time of crushing, was beginning. But from Shaka's perspective, this was not chaos. It was reorganization. A violent reshaping of the world into something stronger. By the time Shaka seized control of the Zulu clan itself, he inherited a minor chiefdom and immediately transformed it into the nucleus of a rising power. The old ways were gone. War was no longer seasonal. Discipline was no longer optional, and fear was no longer a weakness. It was a tool, and with it, Shaka was ready to carve an empire, the making of a warrior state. How Shaka transformed society into a weapon. An army can win battles, but only a state can sustain war. Shaka understood this instinctively. Military reform alone was not enough. If the Zulu were to survive and dominate, every aspect of life had to serve a single purpose. War became the center of gravity. Once Shaka took control of the Zulu chieftainship, he dismantled the remaining limits on his authority. Councils still existed, but they no longer governed. They advised when invited. Decision-making was centralized. Orders were absolute. Loyalty was no longer owed to lineage or clan elders. It was owed directly to the king. This shift was revolutionary and terrifying. Regimental life expanded beyond the battlefield. Warriors lived in military settlements, trained constantly, and were forbidden to marry until permitted. Marriage was no longer a personal milestone. It was a reward for service. This gave Shaka complete control over population growth, alliances, and loyalty. Young men lived for the regiment. Elders lived in fear of replacement. Families lived with uncertainty. Discipline extended into daily life. Minor disobedience was punished harshly. Public executions were not rare. They were instructional. Fear was not hidden. It was displayed. Shaka believed hesitation spread faster than courage. Food distribution was regulated. Cattle were seized and redistributed to reward loyalty. Wealth became conditional. Even mourning was controlled. After the death of Shaka's mother, Nandi, he ordered a period of intense national grief. Normal life halted. Fields were left untended. Those who failed to show proper sorrow were executed. This was not madness. It was a test. Shaka was measuring obedience, and the people obeyed. The Zulu state had crossed a point of no return. Expansion accelerated. Neighboring clans faced three choices: submit and be absorbed, flee and scatter, resist and be destroyed. Many chose flight, triggering waves of displacement across southern Africa. Entire communities collapsed or migrated, spreading violence outward like shock waves. This was Mfikane in full force. Yet inside the Zulu core, order prevailed. Shaka appointed commanders based on merit. He rewarded efficiency. Failure was unforgivable, but excellence was elevated regardless of origin. This created fierce competition. Ambition replaced tradition. Fear sharpened performance. Information became power. Scouts monitored rival movements. Messengers carried orders with absolute urgency. Delays were punished. Speed became doctrine. The Zulu military machine functioned with precision unmatched in the region, but the human cost was enormous. Constant warfare drained communities. Young men died far from home. Survivors returned hardened, silent, changed. Emotional expression was discouraged. Grief was private or fatal. Shaka did not seek love. He sought stability through dominance. From his perspective, cruelty was preventative. Terror reduced rebellion. Obedience saved lives in the long term. History would judge him harshly or heroically, depending on perspective. But one fact is undeniable. By the early 1820s, the Zulu were no longer a minor clan. They were a centralized, militarized power capable of reshaping the political map of southern Africa. And yet, the very system that made Shaka unstoppable was quietly turning inward. Absolute authority bred paranoia. Fear eliminated honest counsel. Loyalty masked ambition. The warrior state was strong, but it was fragile at the top. And soon, the man who had forged it through discipline and terror would face the same forces he had unleashed. The Mfikane begins. The age of crushing and displacement. History rarely records the suffering that power leaves behind. It records victories, names, and borders, but not the silence where villages once stood. As the Zulu state expanded under Shaka, its influence spread far beyond its borders. What followed was not a single war, but a chain reaction, a violent reshaping of southern Africa remembered as the Mfikane, the time of crushing. It did not begin with chaos. It began with pressure. The Zulu military system destroyed the old balance between clans. Communities that once relied on ritual conflict now face annihilation. The old rules no longer applied. A defeated clan could not simply withdraw and rebuild. Survivors were absorbed, scattered, or hunted down. Flight became survival. Entire populations abandoned ancestral lands, driving cattle ahead of them, carrying children on their backs, leaving grave behind. These refugees clashed with other communities, spreading violence outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. The Zulu did not conquer all of these lands directly. Their power displaced, rather than occupied. Former rivals became warlords in new territories. Militarized groups carried Zulu tactics far beyond KwaZulu-Natal. Discipline, regimental organization, and close combat warfare spread across the region, copied, adapted, and weaponized by others. The Mfikane was not a genocide plan from the center. It was an uncontrolled consequence of transformation. Famine followed violence. Fields were abandoned. Cattle herds were lost. Trade routes collapsed. Communities that had survived droughts for generations now faced starvation amid constant movement. Children grew up without stable homes. Elders died without passing on memory. Oral histories fractured. The psychological toll was immense. Trust disappeared. Strangers were threats. Even allies were temporary. Survival replaced tradition as the highest value. Yet within the Zulu heartland, Shaka maintained order. The contradiction was stark. Inside the state, discipline, structure, purpose. Outside it, collapse, fear, displacement. Shaka viewed this as inevitability. From his perspective, weakness invited destruction. Those who fled did so because they could not adapt. Those who resisted had chosen their fate. This worldview justified relentless expansion. But not all violence was sanctioned. Some commanders exploited chaos for personal gain. Raids escalated beyond strategic necessity. Old grievances resurfaced under the cover of conquest. Shaka punished disobedience severely, but even his reach had limits. As territory expanded, control thinned. The Mfikane created new powers. Groups like the Ndebele, led by former Zulu commanders, carried Shaka's methods northward, founding their own states through conquest. Others fortified mountain strongholds or retreated into remote regions, reshaping political geography. Southern Africa entered a new era, one defined by militarization. The old clan world was gone, but the cost began to weigh even on the Zulu themselves. Constant campaigning exhausted regiments. Food shortages strained loyalty. Families questioned endless sacrifice. Shaka responded not with reform, but with greater control. Discipline tightened. Punishments increased. Surveillance expanded. Paranoia crept in. Enemies were everywhere, real or imagined. The same fear Shaka used to control his people now began to isolate him from them. And yet, for a time, the system held. The Zulu state stood unmatched. Its name inspired dread. Its warriors moved like a single body. No rival dared confront it directly. But history does not pause for dominance. Beyond the horizon, forces were gathering that Shaka could not intimidate. Forces armed not with spears and shields, but with trade networks, firearms, and imperial ambition. The Mfikane had reshaped the region, but it had also weakened it. And soon, the consequences of upheaval would return, not from fleeing clans, but from a world that did not fear Zulu discipline at all. Empire built on fear and order. How the Zulu Empire was maintained. Conquest is loud. Control is quiet. By the height of Shaka's power, the Zulu were no longer expanding blindly. They were governing through fear, structure, and relentless organization. This was not a tribal horde. It was a centralized system. Territory was divided into controlled zones. Local leaders were retained only if they demonstrated absolute loyalty. Any hint of independence was eliminated quickly and publicly. Shaka understood a fundamental truth. Rebellion does not begin with weapons. It begins with doubt. Information became the backbone of power. Scouts monitored movement along borders. Informants embedded themselves among absorbed communities. Messengers ran tirelessly, carrying orders across vast distances with speed that astonished outsiders. Delay was betrayal. Hesitation was defiance. Punishment was swift. Public executions served a dual purpose. They removed threats and educated the population. Fear replaced uncertainty. Predictability replaced chaos. Yet Shaka did not rely on terror alone. He rewarded loyalty generously. Captured cattle were redistributed. Successful commanders were promoted. Warriors who distinguished themselves were granted status. wives, and land. This created a brutal incentive structure. Serve well and you rise. Fail and you disappear. Cultural identity was reshaped. Conquered peoples were not erased. They were absorbed. Their young men were inducted into regiments. Their traditions were filtered through Zulu dominance. Over time, resistance faded, replaced by survival through conformity. Language, dress, and military practice standardized. Identity became political. Psychological warfare extended beyond borders. Shaka allowed stories of Zulu brutality to spread unchecked, even exaggerated. Fear traveled faster than armies. Many opponents surrendered before contact, saving Zulu lives and resources. Victory without battle was the ideal outcome. This reputation was carefully maintained, but maintaining control required constant vigilance. Shaka trusted no one completely. Assassination attempts, real or imagined, haunted him. He tested loyalty relentlessly. Even family members were not exempt from suspicion. This paranoia was not weakness. It was a cost of absolute power. The empire functioned efficiently, but it lacked resilience. No mechanisms existed for dissent. No safe channel for correction. Fear suppressed honesty. Advisors spoke cautiously. Silence replaced truth. The system depended entirely on one man's will. And that was its greatest vulnerability. When Shaka's mother died, the empire shook. His grief was absolute. His response was catastrophic. Normal life halted. Crops failed. Executions multiplied. Even loyal subjects questioned the cost of obedience. For the first time, fear no longer felt protective. It felt destructive. Whispers began. Not rebellion, but survival instinct. Shaka sensed it. The same intelligence network that had protected him now fed his paranoia. He tightened control further. He trusted fewer people. He ruled alone. But power isolates. The empire remained strong, yet the foundation was cracking. And within the shadows of order, the men closest to Shaka began to calculate something he had never allowed others to consider. A future without him. The death of Shaka. Assassination and aftermath. Absolute power does not collapse suddenly. It erodes quietly until a single moment makes the damage visible. By 1828, Shaka ruled an empire built on obedience, fear, and relentless discipline. But the man who had forged it was no longer the same commander who had risen through merit and vision. Grief had unbalanced him. The death of his mother, Nandi, removed the last human anchor in his life. She had been his defender, his justification, his emotional boundary. Without her, restraint vanished. Mourning became law. Fields were abandoned. Births were forbidden. Normal rhythms of life collapsed under enforced grief. Thousands died, not from war, but from exhaustion, famine, and execution. This was no longer strategy. It was domination of reality itself. The warrior state began to fracture from within. Commanders feared speaking truth. Elders feared offering counsel. Even loyal warriors whispered privately, calculating survival rather than victory. Shaka sensed betrayal everywhere. His punishments grew unpredictable. His trust narrowed to almost nothing. Authority became personal, not systemic, and that made him vulnerable. Among those closest to him were his half-brothers, Dingaan and Mlangana. They had survived under his rule by obedience, but they understood its cost. They saw what others could not say aloud. If Shaka continued, the state would destroy itself. Conspiracy did not arise from ambition alone. It arose from exhaustion. The moment came quietly. Shaka was unguarded, a rare occurrence. The men he trusted struck quickly. There was no battle, no last speech, no resistance. The king who had commanded armies died by a spear thrust from those within his own circle. He was approximately 41 years old. News of his death spread fast in fear. There was no uprising, no collapse. The empire remained. This revealed the ultimate. He had built a system that no longer needed him. Dingaan assumed power immediately. Order was restored. Execution slowed. Mourning ended. Life cautiously resumed. The terror eased, but the discipline remained. Shaka's legacy was not erased. It was institutionalized. His military reforms endured. His regimental system survived. His methods shaped generations of warriors. But the emotional intensity that had driven his vision died with him. History would struggle to categorize Shaka. Was he a tyrant? A military genius? A product of trauma? A necessary destroyer? The answer was all of it. He forged unity through violence. He protected his people by terrifying them. He turned suffering into strength and then drowned in it. After his death, the Zulu state entered a new phase. Less brutal, more stable, still dangerous. But now, without the absolute force of Shaka's personality, new challenges would emerge, not from within Africa alone, but from an expanding world that viewed the Zulu not as a civilization, but as an obstacle. Kings after the Titan, Dingaan, Pan, and the fading shadow of Shaka. When Shaka died, the world did not end. It adjusted. That alone proved how deeply his system had taken root. Dingaan, the half-brother who had helped orchestrate Shaka's assassination, ascended the throne immediately. His first priority was survival, not conquest, not reform, but stabilization. The Zulu people were exhausted. Years of constant mobilization, forced mourning, and ruthless discipline had stretched society to its limit. Dingaan understood something Shaka no longer did. A state can be feared into existence, but it must be governed to endure. He reversed many of Shaka's most extreme decrees. Agricultural cycles were restored. Families were allowed to grieve privately rather than collectively. The endless executions slowed. But Dingaan faced a fundamental problem. He lacked Shaka's authority. The warriors obeyed him, but they did not revere him. The commanders followed orders, but they remembered who had truly forged the empire. Dingaan ruled in Shaka's shadow. To maintain control, he relied increasingly on suspicion and secrecy. He moved his capital frequently. He listened more than he spoke. He eliminated rivals quietly rather than publicly. Yet danger was no longer coming only from within. By the 1830s, a new force was moving into southern Africa, not as armies at first, but as settlers. The Voortrekkers, Dutch-descended farmers migrating inland from the Cape, crossed into Zulu-influenced territory, seeking land and independence from British rule. They were armed, organized, and unfamiliar with Zulu political realities. At first, contact was cautious. Treaties were discussed. Agreements were proposed. Dingaan attempted diplomacy, but trust was thin on both sides. The situation collapsed catastrophically. In 1838, Dingaan ordered the killing of Voortrekker leader Piet Retief and his delegation during what had appeared to be treaty negotiations. Soon after, Zulu forces attacked Voortrekker camps, killing hundreds of settlers, including women and children. This was not Shaka's style of warfare. Shaka had fought armies. Dingaan had attacked communities. The response was inevitable. Later that year, at the Battle of Blood River, a vastly outnumbered Voortrekker force used firearms, fortifications, and discipline to annihilate a Zulu army. Thousands died. For the first time, the limits of Zulu military power were brutally exposed. Dingaan's authority collapsed. He fled north, pursued by rivals and former allies. Eventually, he was killed, not by Europeans, but by African enemies who sensed his weakness. The throne passed to another brother, Pan. Pan was different. He was cautious, politically flexible, and willing to compromise with external powers. Where Shaka had dominated and Dingaan had reacted, Pan adapted. Under Pan, the Zulu Kingdom stabilized once more, but at a cost. Territory was reduced. Independence was negotiated rather than enforced. European powers were no longer distant observers. They were active participants in Zulu politics. Pan ruled longer than any previous Zulu king. His reign was relatively peaceful by Zulu standards, but it marked a transition. The kingdom was no longer expanding. It was managing decline. When Pan died, his son Cetshwayo inherited the throne. Cetshwayo had grown up hearing stories of Shaka, the victories, the terror, the discipline. He understood the military system intimately and believed it could still protect the Zulu nation. But the world had changed. Europe was industrializing. Firearms were improving rapidly. Empires were no longer negotiating. They were annexing. Cetshwayo attempted reform. He modernized command structures, enforced discipline, and prepared for conflict. not with neighboring tribes, but with the British Empire itself. And for a moment, it seemed possible. In 1879, at the Battle of Isenlawena, Zulu forces achieved one of the most shocking victories in colonial history, overwhelming a British army using tactics that traced directly back to Shaka's reforms. The world was stunned. But victory did not mean survival. The British returned with overwhelming force, advanced weaponry, and imperial resolve. The Zulu Kingdom was systematically dismantled. Sechweo was captured. The kingdom was partitioned. Internal rivalries were encouraged. The Zulu state, once forged by Shaka's vision, was broken apart not by weakness, but by an industrial empire that no pre-industrial society could resist indefinitely. And yet, Shaka's shadow never disappeared. Even as the kingdom fell, his name endured, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of African state-building, resistance, and complexity. He had not simply created an army. He had created an identity. And that identity outlived the empire itself. Shaka Zulu, myth, memory, and the war over his legacy. History does not remember power evenly. Some figures are softened by time. Others are sharpened. Shaka Zulu was sharpened. From the moment Europeans began writing about him, Shaka was transformed, not into a man, but into a symbol. Sometimes a monster, sometimes a genius, often both at once. But rarely was he allowed to be human. Colonial writers portrayed Shaka as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a savage king ruling through terror alone. His wars were exaggerated into genocides. His discipline was framed as madness. His authority was reduced to cruelty. These narratives served a purpose. If African states were shown as inherently violent and unstable, then European conquest could be framed as order replacing chaos. Shaka became evidence, not of African sophistication, but supposed African excess. Yet, when historians began re-examining Zulu oral histories, archaeological evidence, and regional context, a different picture emerged. Shaka did not invent violence in southern Africa. He inherited a fractured region already shaped by competition, drought, migration, and conflict. The Mfikane, the period of upheaval often blamed entirely on Shaka, was not caused by one man. It was a convergence of pressures. Shaka's response was radical, but it was not irrational. He centralized power. He professionalized warfare. He enforced unity through systems, not just fear. His reforms mirrored patterns seen across world history, from Roman legions to Mongol Tumuns. What shocked European observers was not brutality. It was effectiveness. An African state had achieved military and political coherence without European guidance. That was uncomfortable. But Shaka was not a flawless hero either. Zulu oral traditions do not hide his cruelty. Executions were real. Collective punishments were real. His later years showed increasing paranoia, especially after the death of his mother, Nandi. Grief hardened into obsession. The mourning laws, which forbade planting crops and ordered mass executions, pushed society toward breaking point. Even loyal commanders feared the future. Shaka's assassination was not a foreign plot. It was an internal correction. African societies were not passive victims of strong men. They responded, resisted, and recalibrated power when necessary. That complexity is often erased. Modern media continues the distortion. Films and novels often exaggerate Shaka into a near-mythical warlord, towering, shouting, endlessly violent. The quieter truths are ignored. His use of diplomacy, his understanding of logistics, his restraint in early campaigns, his respect for intelligence and loyalty. Shaka rarely fought blindly. He planned. He observed. He learned. His true legacy lies not in body counts, but in state formation. Before Shaka, the Zulu were a minor clan. After Shaka, they were a nation. Language, identity, military service, and political loyalty fused into a single system. Even after the kingdom fell, that identity endured. Colonial borders could not erase it. Partition could not dissolve it. Today, millions identify as Zulu, not because an empire survived, but because an identity did. That is power beyond conquest. Shaka also forces uncomfortable comparisons. Many figures celebrated in European history, Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, caused destruction on massive scales. Yet they are framed as visionaries, reformers, empire builders. Shaka is often denied that nuance. Why? Because acknowledging his strategic brilliance forces a reassessment of African history itself, not as a footnote to colonialism, but as a complex, autonomous story. In post-apartheid South Africa, Shaka's memory remains contested. To some, he is a symbol of resistance and unity. To others, a warning about unchecked authority. Both interpretations are valid. History is not about choosing saints or villains. It is about understanding systems, choices, and consequences. Shaka was a product of his environment and a force that reshaped it. He did not seek to create an empire that would last forever. He sought to ensure survival in a world of relentless competition. That world eventually changed faster than any spear-based society could adapt. But for a brief moment in history, the Zulu Kingdom stood as proof that Africa was not waiting to be discovered, civilized, or organized. It was already doing all three on its own terms. Shaka Zulu did not lose to weakness. He lost to time. And time, unlike armies, defeats everyone. Life inside the Zulu world, beyond spears and battles. To understand the Zulu Kingdom, one must step away from the battlefield. War made the Zulu famous, but society kept them alive. Behind every regiment stood a carefully structured civilian world. Farmers, herders, craftsmen, women, elders, and children, all bound together by obligation, ritual, and identity. The Zulu were not nomads. They were agriculturalists and pastoralists. Cattle formed the foundation of economic life. Wealth was measured not in gold or land deeds, but in herds. Cattle were currency. Cattle were status. Cattle were survival. They paid bride wealth. They settled disputes. They fed armies. To lose cattle was to lose standing in society. Shaka understood this deeply. His military reforms were inseparable from economic control. Regiments were not allowed to marry until granted permission, ensuring that young men served the state before forming independent households. Marriage was not romance-driven. It was political, economic, and social. Women were central to Zulu life, not passive figures, but active participants in production and continuity. They built homesteads, farmed crops, managed food supplies, raised children, and preserved oral history. While Zulu society was patriarchal, women held influence within households and kin networks. Senior women advised chiefs. Mothers shaped warriors long before they carried shields. Nandi, Shaka's mother, was not an exception. She was a product of the system, strong, resilient, respected. Zulu homesteads, or kraals, were carefully organized. The circular layout was symbolic and functional. Cattle occupied the center, physically and spiritually, while families lived around them. Nothing was accidental. The shape reinforced unity. The cattle reinforced dependence. The circle reinforced protection. Spiritual belief was woven into daily life. The Zulu believed in a creator figure, Unkalunkalu, but daily spiritual interactions centered on ancestors. The dead were not gone. They watched, judged, and intervened. Rituals honored them. Dreams carried messages. Illness could be spiritual imbalance. This belief system shaped leadership. A king was not only a ruler, he was a mediator between the living and the ancestors. If the land failed or disease spread, responsibility fell upward. Authority carried spiritual risk. Discipline, often misunderstood as cruelty, was seen as necessary order. In a world without written law, enforcement had to be visible. Shaka's harsh punishments terrified outsiders, but within Zulu logic, disorder threatened collective survival. Still, the system demanded balance. When Shaka crossed that line, when discipline became obsession, society corrected itself. This is often overlooked. Zulu society was not blind obedience. It was conditional loyalty. Chiefs ruled as long as they fulfilled obligation. Protection, prosperity, and justice. Failure invited removal. The regimental system extended beyond warfare. Regiments built roads, cleared land, and maintained royal homesteads. Military service was a civic service. Young men gained identity, brotherhood, and purpose. Age-grade organization ensured generational stability. Elders advised. Youth served. Authority flowed predictably. It was not democratic, but it was structured. Education occurred through participation, not classrooms. History was preserved orally, through praise poems, genealogies, and ritual storytelling. Memory mattered. Names carried weight. Ancestry defined legitimacy. To forget history was to weaken identity. This is why Shaka stories survived colonial disruption. Even after defeat, dispossession, and partition, Zulu identity did not vanish, because it was not stored in buildings or documents. It was stored in people. European observers often misunderstood this world. They saw warriors and assumed savagery. They saw hierarchy and assumed tyranny. They saw ritual and assumed superstition. What they failed to see was coherence. Zulu society functioned as an integrated system, military, economic, spiritual, and cultural, adapted to its environment. It was not frozen in time. It evolved. After Shaka, reform softened. After European contact, adaptations accelerated. Christianity spread. Wage labor emerged. Urban migration reshaped identity. Yet continuity remained. Even today, Zulu cultural practices, respect for elders, ancestral rituals, language, and clan identity persist alongside modern life. This resilience is part of Shaka's legacy, not because he controlled everything, but because he unified systems that could endure change. The Zulu were not defined by violence. They were defined by order, and that order allowed them to face a brutal century with identity intact, even when sovereignty was lost. Empires can fall. Cultures survive. The Zulu versus the Empire, resistance, partition, and survival. When the British Empire turned its full attention toward Zululand, it did not see a nation. It saw a problem. The Zulu Kingdom was militarily capable, politically independent, and strategically inconvenient. It sat between British-controlled territories and growing settler colonies. It had to be neutralized. The justification came wrapped in diplomacy. In 1878, British High Commissioner Sir Henry Bartle Frere delivered an ultimatum to King Sechweo, demands designed to be rejected: disband the Zulu army, accept British oversight, surrender sovereignty. No independent state could accept this. War followed. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 began with British overconfidence. Modern rifles, artillery, and imperial reputation convinced commanders that victory would be swift. They underestimated discipline. At Isandlwana, Zulu regiments executed a textbook encirclement, the classic horns of the buffalo. British lines collapsed. Over 1,300 soldiers were killed. It was one of the worst defeats in British colonial history. The empire was humiliated. The response was relentless. Reinforcements poured in. New strategies were deployed. Fortifications, Gatling guns, and scorched earth tactics shifted the balance. At Ulundi, the Zulu capital was destroyed. Sechweo was captured and exiled. But conquest did not bring stability. Instead of restoring the kingdom, the British fragmented it. Zululand was divided into 13 chiefdoms, deliberately weakening centralized authority. Rivalries were encouraged. Civil conflict erupted. This was empire by design. Divide, destabilize, control. The result was chaos. Former allies fought each other. Land was lost to settlers. Cattle herds, the economic backbone of Zulu society, were decimated. Sechweo was eventually allowed to return, but with limited authority. His rule was symbolic, not sovereign. He died shortly after. Resistance did not end. In 1906, long after the fall of the kingdom, Zulu people rose again during the Bamata Rebellion, protesting colonial taxes and forced labor. The response was brutal. Thousands were killed. Leaders were executed. Resistance was crushed, but resentment endured. Colonial rule reshaped Zulu life profoundly. Land dispossession forced men into migrant labor, mines, railways, cities. Families were fractured. Traditional authority was undermined or co-opted, yet identity persisted. The Zulu language survived. Customs adapted. Oral history continued. Even under apartheid, Zulu identity became a source of both control and resistance, manipulated by the state, but also used by leaders to mobilize dignity and memory. Chiefs became administrators. Kings became cultural symbols. Power was constrained, but not erased. Colonialism failed to eliminate the Zulu. It merely changed the battlefield. By the mid-20th century, the struggle was no longer fought with spears. It was fought with politics, labor movements, and cultural survival. The Zulu had faced annihilation before. They had adapted before, and they would do so again, because empire could take land, but it could not fully take identity. From kingdom to people, Zulu identity in the modern world. The Zulu Kingdom fell in the 19th century. The Zulu people did not. When colonial borders hardened into apartheid, Zululand was no longer a sovereign state. It became a region, administered, regulated, and economically exploited. Yet identity does not require a throne. Under apartheid, the South African government attempted to control African populations through artificial homelands. Zululand became part of KwaZulu, a territory designed to separate Zulu people from political power. Traditional authority was preserved, but hollowed out. Kings and chiefs were allowed to exist, but only within strict limits. They could manage culture, not sovereignty. This arrangement created tension. Some leaders cooperated, hoping to protect their people. Others resisted, viewing the system as a betrayal of Zulu autonomy. Zulu identity was weaponized by the state and by resistance movements. Language became a battleground. Schools taught history selectively. Oral traditions were dismissed as folklore rather than legitimate memory. But culture adapted. Music, praise, poetry, ceremony, and storytelling carried history forward. Urban migrants brought traditions into cities, reshaping them without abandoning them. Zulu was spoken in mines, factories, and townships. Identity moved with the people. The late 20th century brought political struggle. Zulu leaders emerged with different visions of survival. Some emphasized ethnic unity. Others aligned with broader anti-apartheid movements. The tension was real, sometimes violent, but it reflected an old truth. Zulu society had always debated power internally. After apartheid fell, South Africa became a democracy, but history did not reset. Land remained unequal. Poverty persisted. Cultural wounds remained open. Yet Zulu identity entered a new phase. It was no longer about resistance alone. It became about recognition. The Zulu monarchy was restored in ceremonial form. Kings became cultural custodians rather than rulers, symbols of continuity rather than authority. Critics saw this as empty. Supporters saw something else, a reminder that identity had survived conquest, partition, and engineered division. Modern Zulu life is not frozen in the past. It is dynamic. Zulu people are urban and rural, traditional and modern, global and local, warriors and professionals. Culture is not preserved by isolation. It is preserved by adaptation. Ceremonies coexist with smartphones. Ancestral rituals coexist with modern religion. Pride coexists with critique. This complexity is often ignored in popular portrayals. Zulu identity is not nostalgia. It is continuity. And that continuity traces back to the moment Shaka transformed scattered clans into a shared system, not because he wanted immortality, but because he demanded cohesion. Today, when Zulu history is taught, debated, and reclaimed, it challenges a long-standing narrative. Africa did not begin with colonialism. It did not wait for structure, law, or identity. It produced them in its own way. The Zulu story is not about inevitable defeat. It is about endurance. Empires rise and fall. People endure. Shaka Zulu in popular culture. Between legend and distortion. Most people do not meet Shaka Zulu through history books. They meet him through images, film scenes of charging warriors, paintings of a towering king, stories that blur fact into fantasy. Popular culture did not preserve Shaka. It reinvented him. Early European accounts shaped the foundation. Missionaries, traders, and colonial officials wrote for audiences that expected savagery. Complexity was inconvenient. Nuance was dangerous. So Shaka became a spectacle. His discipline became cruelty without purpose. His reforms became madness. His victories became massacres without context. These portrayals spread globally. Later films and television series reinforced the pattern. Shaka was shown as constantly enraged, physically immense, almost superhuman, shouting orders, killing impulsively. This made for drama. It did not make for history. What pop culture often misses is restraint. Shaka was not constantly at war. Long periods were spent reorganizing, training, and consolidating. Diplomacy existed. Alliances mattered. Violence was a tool, not an addiction. Another distortion lies in scale. Battles are often portrayed as endless human waves against firearms. In reality, Zulu commanders avoided frontal assaults against unknown technology until forced by circumstance. Isandlwana was not reckless bravery. It was tactical execution. Popular culture also isolates Shaka from his society. He is shown as a singular force of will, dominating passive followers. This erases the councils, commanders, and cultural logic that made his reforms possible. No leader reshapes a society alone. Zulu oral tradition remembers Shaka differently, not as a monster, but as a demanding, complex ruler whose early years brought stability and pride, and whose later years brought fear and imbalance. Both truths coexist. Modern reinterpretations have begun to shift. African filmmakers, historians, and writers increasingly reclaim the narrative, portraying Shaka as a strategist shaped by his environment rather than a caricature. Yet global media still prefers simplicity. Why? Because myths travel faster than nuance. A screaming warlord is easier to sell than a disciplined state builder. But distortion has consequences. When African history is flattened into spectacle, it reinforces old assumptions that power without European influence must be irrational and order must come from outside. Shaka's story challenges that. The popularity of Zulu imagery, shields, spears, chants, often strips them of meaning. Symbols become aesthetics. Context disappears. What remains is entertainment, not understanding. This does not mean pop culture is worthless. It creates curiosity. But curiosity must be followed by correction. History deserves depth. Shaka deserves to be remembered not as legend alone, but as evidence that African societies produce thinkers, reformers, and leaders who shape history on their own terms. Between myth and memory lies responsibility to tell the story fully. Warriors compared Zulu, samurai, and Spartans. Across history, certain warrior societies rise above others, not because they fought more, but because they built systems that shaped identity. The Zulu, the samurai of Japan, and the Spartans of ancient Greece are often grouped together in popular imagination, but comparison demands care. Each emerged from different environments, pressures, and philosophies. Similarities exist, but so do crucial differences. Training and discipline. Spartan life was state ownership. From childhood, boys were removed from families and molded for war. Individual identity was secondary to the collective. Samurai training was lifelong, combining martial skill with literacy, ethics, and service to a lord. Zulu warriors trained intensely, but not from birth. Military service was age-based, tied to regiments formed by generation. Identity came from belonging, not isolation. All three valued discipline. Only one allowed warriors to return fully to civilian life. Weapons and warfare. Spartans fought in tight phalanxes, shields locked, discipline absolute. Their power came from cohesion. Samurai emphasized individual mastery, swordsmanship, archery, horsemanship, refined through personal honor. Zulu warfare focused on mobility and encirclement. The short stabbing spear, the ikawa, was designed for close combat, decisive and brutal. Each adapted to terrain. No system was universally superior. Honor and death. Spartan honor was obedience. Survival mattered less than duty. Samurai honor centered on loyalty and self-control. Failure could be redeemed through ritual suicide. Zulu honor was communal. Cowardice endangered the group. Bravery protected identity. Death was not sought, but it was accepted. Social structure. Sparta was a closed elite ruling over a large enslaved population. Samurai were a warrior class within a stratified society. Zulu warriors were citizens first. Military service was an obligation, not a caste. This difference mattered. It allowed rapid mobilization and rapid return to civilian stability. Leadership. Spartan kings were constrained by councils. Samurai served lords within rigid hierarchies. Zulu kings commanded, but relied on consensus, loyalty, and cultural legitimacy. When that legitimacy failed, removal followed. Myth versus reality. All three are mythologized. Spartans as fearless machines. Samurai as flawless swordsmen. Zulu as endless charging warriors. Reality was more complex. Fear existed. Strategy mattered. Politics shaped survival. The Zulus stand apart not because they were better, but because they built a centralized military state without metallurgy, cavalry, or firearms, in an environment Europeans assumed made that impossible. That assumption was wrong. The comparison reveals something uncomfortable. Advanced systems are not defined by technology alone. They are defined by organization, belief, and purpose. The Zulus shared those qualities, and for a time, they rivaled any warrior culture in the world. What the Zulu story teaches the modern world. The story of the Zulu is not a tragedy. It is a lesson. Too often, history treats societies like the Zulu as temporary, as if they existed only to be conquered, studied, and remembered in fragments. But the Zulu were never temporary. They were precise. They arose in response to pressure, environmental, political, and social. They adapted faster than their rivals. They centralized when fragmentation meant extinction. Shaka Zulu did not invent power. He organized it. He recognized a truth that echoes across all successful civilizations. Survival favors structure, not chaos, not sentiment. Structure. The Zulu military system was not born from bloodlust. It was born from necessity. In a world of competing clans, drought, and migration, hesitation meant annihilation. Shaka removed hesitation. But his story also warns against imbalance. When discipline hardened into fear, when unity collapsed into obsession, correction followed. Shaka's assassination was not betrayal. It was society restoring equilibrium. That matters. It proves African political systems were not mindless autocracies. They had limits. They had consequences. The fall of the Zulu Kingdom does not signal failure. It signals collision. No pre-industrial society, no matter how disciplined, could indefinitely resist an industrial empire armed with rifles, artillery, and global supply chains. The Zulu did not fall because they were primitive. They fell because the rules of warfare changed faster than adaptation allowed. This distinction is critical. Too many histories frame colonial conquest as proof of superiority. It was not superiority. It was asymmetry. And even within that asymmetry, the Zulus shocked the world. Ice Sandalwood remains one of history's great reminders. Organization, morale, and tactical intelligence can overcome technology, at least once. The Zulu story also challenges modern assumptions about progress. We often equate advancement with machines, writing systems, or architecture, but the Zulu achieved something equally complex. Mass mobilization, national identity, legal authority, military doctrine, cultural cohesion, all without bureaucracy, industry, or foreign models. That should force a rethink. The Zulu were not almost a state. They were a state. Modern South Africa carries this legacy quietly. Zulu identity persists not as nostalgia, but as continuity. Language, ritual, respect, and memory survived land loss, forced labor, apartheid, and globalization. This endurance is the final victory. Empires leave ruins. Cultures leave descendants. Shaka Zulu's name still provokes discomfort because his existence disrupts simple narratives. He does not fit neatly into hero or villain. He cannot be dismissed as primitive. He cannot be romanticized without consequence. He demands seriousness. And so does African history as a whole. The Zulu story teaches that civilization is not defined by who writes history, but by who organizes life effectively under pressure. It teaches that identity can outlive sovereignty, and it reminds us that the past is not a hierarchy of worth, but a record of human adaptation. The Zulu were not overlooked because they were insignificant. They were overlooked because acknowledging them requires humility. They remind the modern world of something uncomfortable. Human intelligence, discipline, and statecraft did not belong to one continent. They never did.